In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. If you can, get a piece of paper and a pencil, because I want to talk to you about something that can make the difference between life and death for you and your family, especially if you expect to live through a significant number of years in this century. I want to talk to you about climate change, and I want to explain to you why it is imperative that you get this knowledge and that you organize your life, your family structure, in order to enhance the likelihood of your survival. Usually, we descendants of slaves are the last to get pertinent information concerning what survival skills we will need for the future. And that applies to all levels of our social existence, as well as our natural existence, that is to say, our relation to the natural world. Now, this talk has to do with our relation to the natural world as it has been impacted by the Industrial Revolution and the pollution which has resulted from it. But let's go back in time first. I want to go back to the end of the last ice age. And we're talking about, I would say 20,000 years ago. So 20,000 years ago, the last ice age reached its maximum, after which it started to decline. And what that means is that global average temperatures started to increase, and as a result, that melted the glaciers very slowly, melted the glaciers until they receded north and, of course, south in the southern hemisphere, where Antarctica exists. Now, here's a very important statistic that I want to give you. So if you can, write this down. At the end of the last ice age, the average global temperature was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, it's important for you to write that down because I'm going to call that our baseline, or you may say our benchmark, because at that particular time, what we call the interglacial period or the warming period started to increase in temperature. And that made life for us and other mammals more successful as we were able to expand into areas that were once covered by ice, or we were freed from the constraints that glaciers imposed upon us. Now, let's zoom forward 10,000 years. About 10,000 years ago, the Sahara Desert was a lush, semi-tropical terrain full of life, and human beings and their cultures thrived in that environment. But as the glaciers receded, it caused a change in climate conditions, and as a consequence, the Sahara started to dry up, and people started to move out of that more difficult environment. Many of them moved toward the Nile, and as a consequence, we find the first beginnings of what came to be called ancient Egypt. And of course, the true word for that is Kemet. However, it was not a simple culture. It was a complex culture because not only did people move out of the Sahara toward the Nile, but they moved from what we call today Ethiopia down and up the Nile, and they constructed villages and towns. Now that was happening all over the world. But here's the next statistic that I want to give to you. Write this down. By the time we get to 10,000 years before the present era, the average global temperature had reached 56.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So now there's a difference. Remember, At the end of the Ice Age, the beginning of the end of the Ice Age, which was 20,000 years ago, it was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And now, 10,000 years later, when we start to see these cultures emerge around the great river basins in the world, we see the temperature now is 56 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a difference of over 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, at that time, we begin to see the rise of agricultural economies all over the world. The Indus Valley, ancient Egypt, in what we call China, in what we call Southeast Asia, we see the rise of what would become the so-called great civilizations. Now, we've got to move forward again. And we're going to move forward now to the year 1750. We're getting close to home. In 1750, historians as well as scientists agree that the Industrial Revolution, as we know it, began. It began with the use of fossil fuels to drive steam engines. And those fossil fuels, in the form of coal and wood, started the slow release of extra human-made carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that causes, slowly but surely, what is called a greenhouse effect or warming. Now, note this, write this down. By the time we get to 1750, the average global temperature is still 56.3 degrees Fahrenheit. So, between 10,000 before the present era and 1750, which was just a few centuries ago, the average global temperature was pretty constant. Generally, we're talking about the global temperature. Average was pretty constant at 56.3 degrees. As a consequence, agricultural cultivation increased, and the yields of the basic crops upon which we depend became more and more abundant. And as a consequence, the human population started to skyrocket to its present level at over 7 billion people on the planet Earth. Now, this is what I want to get to now. We, in that period of time, have come to depend upon certain basic crops. Let me name some of them for you. We all know them: corn, wheat, rice, potatoes, soybean. And of those crops, potatoes are the most sensitive to heat. Corn is second most sensitive. Wheat is third most sensitive to heat. And soybean and rice are fourth in line for their sensitivity to heat. Now, I'm telling you that because the crops that we depend on every day when you go to the grocery store, outside of many of the products that you may choose, even the meat, the chicken and the beef, and I hope you don't eat pork, all derive from high yields in one or more of those crops. And let me give you a statistic now. If you can, write this down. Remember, I gave you 53 degrees at the end of the last ice age, and I gave you 56.3 degrees that lasted from about 10,000 years ago to 1750. Now, all of those crops that I've just named thrive when global average temperatures are between 42 degrees Fahrenheit and 112 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the range. So, if you take all of those crops, they're going to thrive as long as the global average temperature is between 42 degrees Fahrenheit and 112 degrees Fahrenheit. Now understand that those crops grow in different temperate zones on the planet. So you're going to find a lot more wheat grown in North America and in Russia. And of course, you're going to find a lot more of those crops grown below in the southern hemisphere outside of the tropical zone in Argentina and other South American countries. And there are crops that are unique to tropical nations as well. But all of these crops, from the northern hemisphere, the tropical zone, down to the southern hemisphere, thrive when the temperature range is between 42 degrees Fahrenheit and 112 degrees Fahrenheit. If we go below 42 degrees Fahrenheit, or if we go above 112 degrees Fahrenheit, we're starting to have problems. That is to say, we are less likely to have higher yields, or the yields that have sustained our population for 100 years. Now, some scientific organizations like the organization which we depend upon for our data calculate that today, 2018, the average global temperature is 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, let me repeat that. 59 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that is significantly warmer than the 56 degrees that I said was constant since the end of the last ice age up to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1750. Now, scientists have found this, that the 59 degrees Fahrenheit temperature is warmer than the global average temperature between 1951 and 1980. I said 1951 and 1980. That should never be the base for us understanding the challenge that we face as a community. What my point is this. My point is very simple. And you can use those temperatures that I gave you to calculate it for yourself. We have reached the threshold for decreasing global crop yields, beginning with potatoes and wheat. What that means is that we're going to have less and less and less potatoes and wheat over the years and decades to come as we move toward the year 2050. And then, of course, as we get closer to the year 2100. If you are a millennial or even a Generation X, you should be very concerned because there are profound economic implications for that change in crop yields. It's called inflation. It means that your dollar will decrease in purchasing power as the cost for these staples increase because of a decrease in the crop yield, the amount of crops that are grown and harvested and distributed to the cities throughout the world. Remember, we have a global economy. Understand also that population rate is continuing to increase, and so there will be a greater demand for corn and wheat and all of the other staples, crops that are cultivated. And remember, it's not just us that eat corn and wheat. We use it as feed for all the animals that we butcher and buy in the supermarkets, chicken and beef primarily. In fact, today, and this is a footnote, there are more pigs and more cows and more chickens on earth than there are wild animals. Let me repeat what I just said. There are more chickens, there are more pigs, and there are more cows than there are wild animals. Such has been the extinction rate caused by what human beings have been doing to the environment for just 400 years. Animals that have been around for millions of years have become extinct. In fact, the extinction rate is 200 species per day. I'm not making a mistake. 200 species per day are going extinct. And that means that they are disappearing from the face of the earth, and their unique genome will never appear again. Now, the difference between 53 degrees Fahrenheit and 56 degrees Fahrenheit is 6 degrees. There has been a global average 6 degree Fahrenheit warming over the last 12,000 years. So if you thought of a curve, it would be shaped like an S for the human population. From our humble beginnings at the end of the last ice age, through this interglacial warming, and now all of the evidence points to this fact. We have reached a peak on this planet, and life has been dying as a consequence of our near absolute exploitation of the resources and the waste that has resulted therefrom. We have dominated the planet, controlled the resources to such an extent that now livestock outnumbers the wild animals in nature. Civilizations, as we have known them, were born and raised worldwide during just this last 12,000 years. They rose in direct relation to the decline of the ice age and the global warming that occurred, the warming that was conducive to agriculture. All 24 civilizations that have existed, that have come and gone, and a few remain, maybe 3. Ancient Egypt, a dead civilization. The Indus Valley civilization, a dead civilization. And I can go on and on down the list. The great Islamic civilization has ceased to exist. The faith of Islam continues. The faith of Christianity continues. But those civilizations have long died. And we are in a kind of bizarre, macabre lifestyle orientation now. And it is questionable whether we can even classify it as a civilization. All those civilizations depended upon a stable global average temperature because fundamentally, there are basic necessities that we must have in order to live comfortably on this planet. We know we need water, and we must have carbs, and we must have protein in order to grow and thrive in an environment that oftentimes can be and is hostile. Now, the farther below or above the range of global average temperatures we experience means this, that the cultures, political systems, and lifestyles we are accustomed to will gradually decline and eventually cease to exist. In other words, what we are beginning to see is an amplification of tribal, national conflicts and religious conflicts, which really make no sense at all, over increasing scarce resources on this planet. As we continue to wrestle with our basic fundamental animal impulses and egoism, added to the philosophy of individualism, promoted primarily by the Western philosophical orientation. So, increasing political instability will bring down whole nations, and we have seen that, and we are seeing it, and there's more to come. As a consequence, we are seeing increased police repression as more and more poor people march claiming that they want equality, that they want access to opportunity, that they want clean water, that they want food, The problem is there's less food and there's less clean water. And there is no possible way for all of the human beings on the planet to live as people in the United States have been living and in Western Europe for a couple of centuries now. You would need 3 planets in order for all the people on the planet to live the lifestyle, the wasteful lifestyle that has been lived in the United States. It's impossible. It won't happen. As a consequence, there's going to be revolt worldwide, and there's going to be political repression as a consequence. And millions of people are going to die, and millions of people are going to begin to leave impoverished nations and move driven by hope alone that they can find a better life for themselves according to the Western standard that has been promoted by the media. We see that in Africa. We see thousands of Africans going into hostile environments seeking a better life, leaving what many claim to be the richest continent in terms of mineral resources on the planet. We see that in Syria, as thousands of Syrians are migrating into Europe, seeking what? A Western lifestyle, which has been promoted through the media as propaganda. Because most people in the Western world, in the United States, are not living well at all. And we'll talk about that in another talk. Poor people throughout the world at the bottom of the social hierarchies will die off first. Yes, I said they will die off first, as the elite scramble to sequester all life-sustaining resources for themselves. Remember, you're dealing with a small clique, 1% of the global population, certainly in the United States. And let me explain something to you. They are extremely selfish. They do not share outside of their immediate family circles. And they are increasingly wealthy because they will do anything to access the resources and to control them for themselves. Some people are beginning to realize that the virtual social reality many of us choose to participate in never ever had rich meaning at all. At most, it has been just us alone passing time. Let me summarize what I'm trying to communicate to you in this short talk. If global average temperature increases to between 3.6 and 4 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 30 years, and that is a measurement that is supported by 99% of all credible scientists today, from social scientists to physicists, meteorologists, chemists. Seed companies, please listen, seed companies such as Monsanto will control global food cultivation and distribution, especially in situations where most sea life and land life are extinct. As we lose more sea life, as we lose more land life, we become more dependent on those who have sequestered the resources. And as you know, Monsanto has mastered the art of genetically modifying seeds. We call them GMO, genetically modified organisms. The group which controls food and its distribution will control what is left of humanity. What is left of humanity. That will entail racial genocide based upon political policies which will include state government assisted suicide and For example, laws in California just recently, in fact, I think it was Friday, an appellate court reinstated the legality of state-assisted suicide for terminally ill persons. District of Columbia, Oregon, Washington, and Hawaii have already laid the legal groundwork to expand the policy of state-assisted suicide for non-terminally ill persons. Now, what do I mean? The groundwork has been laid. Now, it looks innocent today. Who would oppose a person in extreme pain, terminally ill, with 6 months to die? Who would deny them the choice to receive some medications from the state to end their life of extreme suffering? Well, that's the benign approach to lay the foundation. Benign meaning it is appealing to your sympathy. But you have to project. You've got to project 10, 15, 20, 30 years into the future when global average temperatures, decreasing crop yields, masses revolting all over the world, mass human die-off occurring, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa, and I will discuss that with you in another talk. You must understand that it will expand from what it is now to a point at which anyone who wants to commit suicide will be able to get assistance from the state. And those people who are suffering most will be descendants of slaves and, yes, poor white people. And we see that happening already. 60,000 plus people died of opioid overdose last year. And we all know, based upon the most recent statistics, the suicide rate nationally has increased phenomenally. I'll discuss that in another talk. Now, the danger for descendants of slaves is clear and present. All non-essential, non-white people, as well as non-essential white people, will be expendable as food and water resources continue to decrease well into the 21st century. Now, if you can, find this article. Find this article. It was just released. Water scarcity by 2030 will be true for every second person on Earth, based upon a report from the United Nations. There's not going to be enough water to go around. This is not a joke. This is the challenge that we face. And the challenge for us is clear and present. And it is dangerous. The general idea of a reduced global population was etched in stone in the state of Georgia. When you get a moment after this talk, Google the Georgia Guidestones. It set a population limit of 500 million people on Earth. You are probably not included unless you can entertain the rich who will continue to thrive. It is projected now that by the year 2030, the 1% will control 2/3 of the global wealth. Let me repeat this. Yes, that's obscene. The 1%ers will control 66% of the global wealth. If population is expected to be 9 billion people by the year 2030, then what that means is that 90% of the world's population will be their slaves, living in the most despicable, filthy cesspools imaginable, with dead oceans, poison in the air. With hardly any fertility, no health care, and we can't even call what those folks eat food. That population limit of 500 million, etched in stone, you can see it for yourself, would necessitate a reduction of 8.5 billion people beginning in the year 2030, when the global population is expected to reach, again, 9 billion human beings. And that's just 11 years from now. Count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Probably you'll be here. You may ask, what kind of people can do this? Well, think about this. When the United States was perfecting their use of atomic weapons, the atomic bomb and the hydrogen bomb, they tested those bombs in the South Pacific near the Marshall Islands. Now, please listen. People had been living on the Marshall Islands for countless thousands of years in harmony with their environment. They depended primarily on fish, and of course they had their coconuts and their fruits. And listen, here's the word, they were happy. They didn't have computers, they didn't have television, they didn't have cell phones, but they had happiness. So the United States went to the Marshall Islands in the 50s, it's all documented, and they started testing their nuclear weapons to perfect the use of those weapons to kill hundreds of thousands of people within a matter of seconds. They exploded an atomic bomb or hydrogen bomb every day. I said every day for 12 years. They poisoned the island, made the islands uninhabitable, and countless thousands of the indigenous people who trusted them, who thought that they were speaking truth, just like our own Native Americans, died of cancer, thyroid cancer and other forms of cancer. Their children, their adults. And the United States Congress did not aid them at all. If you get a chance, Google the Marshall Island or Islands nuclear testing and look at the people. Look at their skin color. And you'll know why by the year 2030. It's not going to be a good day for descendants of slaves unless you start to organize now and have the right conversations. And no one who calls themselves a black leader is having the right conversation with you. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.